As we approach the one-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook shooting massacre that claimed the lives of 26 people, including, as we all know, 20 children here, many people are asking why so little has been done here to prevent these gun tragedies going forward. And joining us today to talk about this is U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, who has been an active voice here in changing some of the laws on the books. Senator, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You know, you and I spoke 11 months ago, a few weeks after the tragedy, and we had those indelible images of those tiny white coffins being led from the ceremony, and the tone-deaf response from the NRA and Wayne LaPierre's press conference. And I remember the polls overwhelmingly were supporting this. The feeling and the momentum was something would change. You and I spoke, and you felt confident, you said, that there would be change, not just background checks, but even possibly more, assault weapons, etc. But here we are nearly a year later, and little, if anything, has changed. And even in some states, gun laws have become even more lax. What happened?
First, as you'll recall, what I said then was that this effort would be a marathon, not a sprint, which indeed it is. And we are by no means losing hope or going away. We are as determined as ever. And when I say we, I mean not only the team of political leaders that we have, including the state of Connecticut, which passed very, very strong measures to stop gun violence, leading the nation, very important result, but also the families themselves who have been tremendously courageous and resilient, and certainly they are not away. Those indelible images remain with me as we approach this one-year anniversary. The images of families leaving the Sandy Hook firehouse within hours of the massacre, learning for the first time that their children, those 20 beautiful children and sixth grade educators, would not be coming home that night. And whenever I need inspiration, I think back 1 year ago to the sights and sounds of their grief and pain and the 10,000 or more victims that have perished since as a result of gun violence. So this issue is still very much with us, still urgent and immediate, and I'm determined, as are so many others, that we will pursue strong common sense measures against gun violence.
In fact, we spoke, Senator, to the Newtown Alliance representation last night, and their grace, obviously the families first and foremost, but really the whole city of Newtown, really remarkable. But where is the public on this? Because they, and you I know, have said we have to get the general public to really push the gun lobby on this. But I look at certain numbers where 90% of Americans believe in a universal background check. 3/4 of the NRA members, for crying out loud, even do. But then you look at other national numbers, and when you ask the broader question of tighter gun restrictions, I think it was 55% in the immediate aftermath of Newtown supported it, and now it's less than 50. Where is the public pulse on this?
The public is still very, very supportive of common sense measures. You know, think of it as keeping guns out of the hands of criminals and deranged people, including people who are under protective orders so that they don't assault their spouses or domestic partners. This kind of common sense, sensible measure should include also mental health initiatives, a ban on straw purchases and illegal trafficking of guns. There is a consensus of the American people that we need to do something about gun violence. And only recently, within the past few days, we saw at the University of New Haven yet another threat, a really very frightening threat from someone who owns an assault weapon as well as 2 pistols, brought them onto the campus. So the continuing presence of these problems all around the country, I think, leads to a majority of the American people, even a majority of gun owners, favoring these kinds of common sense measures. There may be some special interests, the NRA, for example, that continues to be opposed, but the majority of the American people, the pulse of America, is with us.
Let me mention that case in New Haven where, thankfully, terrific thinking by law enforcement there prevented what seems to be, would have been a horrific tragedy. He had 2,700 rounds of ammunition, William Dong did, a UNH student. But people point to that, and even the Lanza case where although he was completely deranged, as we learned from the investigation, his mother procured the guns legally for him, for whatever reason gave him to her child. But people say with some resignation, in both the Lanza case and even the case in University of New Haven, they got all this stuff legally. How do you respond to the fact when people say, even if you make the right laws, you really can't stop a crazy person who wants to do bad things?
The point is to reach out to people who are mentally ill and to diagnose and treat them before they commit these horrific acts. And part of the comprehensive program to abate and end gun violence has to be a mental health initiative. The administration recently approved the mental health parity guidelines so that insurance coverage will apply equally to mental health as it does to physical ailments, and that's a step in the right direction, but there have to be more resources, a major initiative. It's common ground for everyone, including gun owners and the NRA. So the point is that Adam Lanza, if you listen to those tapes, what a reminder of the speed that he did this crime, but also the report that was done after the investigation showing how he, in effect, was self-isolated in a room with windows barricaded by garbage bags and living essentially in seclusion with video games, and his only recreation being the shooting that his mother enabled him to do. This kind of person should have been reached before he committed those crimes. So the measures on background checks can't prevent every dangerous person from having a gun, but the other kinds of facets to this program can be very, very helpful.
In terms of a strategy, I've heard people saying if we could do it all over again in the immediate aftermath, maybe it would have been better thought to do a less ambitious package. Instead of including assault weapons and ammo clip restrictions, just focus on background checks. Going forward, Senator, what do you think the best chance and the best strategy is in terms of what you try to pass through the reality of this Washington?
The centerpiece for the strategy going forward has to be a mental health initiative, background checks, which enable enforcement of existing laws that ban criminals and drug addicts and people under court orders from possessing weapons or buying them, and then a ban on illegal trafficking against, again, a law enforcement measure, and straw purchases where somebody goes to buy a gun for someone else who's prohibited from buying it. These kinds of consensus, common sense measures have to be the centerpiece. I happen to think the initial proposal, including a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, was actually weaker than perhaps we might have sought. But the centerpiece has to include basic aids for law enforcement to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and dangerous people, plus a mental health initiative.
But then you deal with the reality of some of the folks that need to get on board in this in Washington and the power of the gun lobby. And we had a recent example of this where the plastic gun ban was set to expire. And then included in that is this new reality of these 3D guns. One would think there would be zero opposition to this, but yet there was and is. Explain some of the reality on the ground of what you're dealing with, even for something I find it hard to believe that anyone could debate isn't commonsensical.
Very hard to believe that anyone would want to enable dangerous people, whether criminals or drug addicts, to have a gun entering a sports arena, a school, a courthouse, an airport, and yet the objection to proceeding with the Non-Detectable Firearms Act, which would prevent that kind of surreptitious entry with a plastic gun, was on the United States Senate. I hope it will not prevent us from going forward with renewing this act. By the way, the act has been renewed twice since it was passed originally in 1988. How anyone could object to it is really beyond me. I hope the objection will relent and recede, but in the meantime, we're going to push forward because we need to protect against the plastic guns that can be produced through a 3D printer. And we know how common those 3D printers are becoming, and the technology is advancing. More and more people will have access to. So these plastic guns will become more prevalent unless we require that a certain amount of metal, which is detectable by a machine placed at the door of a courthouse or a school or a sports arena, will pick it up and prevent that person from entering.
Finally, Senator, obviously with the passing of Nelson Mandela, the world recognizes what a giant he was. But it also got me to thinking, just in context, after 27 years in captivity, he comes out and he's actually able to piece together a nation riven here with racial division and hold it together in amazing circumstances. Yet what we've seen in the past year especially, but even before that in Washington, everything seems to be calculations and opportunism and no sense of national common interest. It is amazing if you just look in context to, the 90s in South Africa and where we are today in Washington, just how divided we are about such, in the big scheme of things, issues that should be so resolvable. And from the outside, at least, it's jarring. I wonder from your perspective.
Nelson Mandela was one of a kind, a unique, historic giant in his championing justice and human rights. He was a person who dwarfed leaders of the world, not only through what he accomplished in bringing democracy to South Africa, but also his personal sense of forgiveness after those backbreaking, heartbreaking years in prison. For him to be able to forgive and seek reconciliation in his country, bringing people together, is not only a historic accomplishment for his nation, but also a personal triumph of good over the lesser instincts that many others would have had to seek revenge or punishment. So I think we can take heart and take as a model what Nelson Mandela did in Washington these days, coming together, putting partisanship aside, disregarding personal differences, hopefully seeking a common path forward on gun violence prevention, as well as some of the other difficult challenges that we face. But for all the criticism of our country, we are still the greatest nation in the history of the world. And you need only to go to an immigration naturalization service, which happens in Connecticut on most Fridays here in the courthouses, several of them on a Friday, 60 or 70 to people each, coming from all across the world, including South Africa, coming to the United States because it is a beacon of opportunity and freedom. And we have an obligation, in a way, it's a covenant to continue and not only to maintain, but actually enhance this great nation, to leave it better than we found it. That's the covenant that each generation makes with another. And we are a nation of immigrants that is unique in the world because we are strong, we are free, and we should never forget how different we are from most nations.
Terrific perspective. And Senator, I know this next week is going to be a painful one in Connecticut, particularly Newtown. But let's hope in the coming year here we can point to more change, which I know you're working on out of Washington. Senator Blumenthal, thank you again.
Thank you.